Right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Catholic Union webinar. My name is Catherine Pepinster, and I'll be chairing tonight's session. Many of you probably already know the Catholic Union. It exists to enable Catholics to be well informed about major issues in our world and also help our parliamentarians be better informed about Catholic teaching on issues they may encounter in their work, such as assisted dying or poverty or war. Now, I have to say that our topic tonight about art causes me to breathe a sigh of relief, and I suspect that others have done the same too, given the large numbers of you present, to talk about something so inspiring as the place of beauty in our lives when the world at the moment can seem such a dark place. Our distinguished guests, Stefan Kaminski and Father Patrick van der Vorst, will be guiding us through the issue, examining the role that beauty plays in the moral formation of the person and society. Now, the late Irish poet, theologian, and philosopher John O'Donoghue insisted that beauty is a human calling. So, what is it? People today might think they're talking about beauty when they're talking about glamour. Do we live in a world that's addicted to the image? Might beauty be about aesthetics? And is one person's idea of beauty another's idea of ugliness? And where is God in all this? With us today, as I mentioned earlier, are Stefan Kaminski and Father Patrick van der Vorst, who are our two speakers. Stefan Kaminski is the director of the Christian Heritage Centre based at Stonyhurst. The centre was founded in 2012 to offer greater spiritual and intellectual engagement with the Christian faith, and its foundation was the collection of artifacts, relics, and books collected by the Jesuits. Stefan joined in 2019 to oversee the expansion of the centre both online and in person. He has a background in teaching, catechetics, and several degrees from Rome universities. Father Patrick van der Vorst is probably the only Catholic priest whose CV includes an appearance on Dragon's Den. He studied at Leuven University in Belgium, where he read law, then came to London more than 30 years ago and started a career in art and antiques, working for Sotheby's and other companies, including his own, Value My Stuff, and he persuaded two dragons to invest £100,000 in it. In 2019, he began training for the priesthood and now is the precentor, that's the person responsible for the liturgy at Westminster Cathedral. He's combined his knowledge of art with faith through his website Christian.art, which combines gospel readings and art. And also, quite a lot of you may well have seen him talking about art on YouTube. Now, Patrick van der Vorst is Belgian, which I have to say I thoroughly approve of, given my father's family was too. And last week I was there visiting Bruges, which I discover is where Father Patrick's from. One of that city's most remarkable buildings is St. John's Hospital, founded by friars and later run by nuns in the Middle Ages. Visit the hospital today and it's a museum. And there's a strong focus there on the importance of hospitality, given it once cared for the poor and the sick. But what really struck me was the part that beauty played in that hospitality. For the nuns commissioned the medieval master Hans Memling to paint works for their chapel to inspire and sustain them in their work and comfort the afflicted. Now, our webinar is going to begin with Father Patrick speaking, and then we'll hear from Stefan Kaminski. They'll speak for about 10 to 15 minutes each, and then I'll ask a few questions, and we hope to include some of you from the audience. Can you please put your questions in the chat and preferably say who you are? So, Father Patrick, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for the very kind introduction. Good to meet you all by virtually. So thank you very much for tuning in. So to talk about the place of beauty here in society and also part of our faith is, of course, a very, very large topic. And there are very different ways to come at it. And within sort of the space of 10, 15 minutes, what I want to do is actually to talk about one example. But before I do that, I think we are very unique in our Catholic faith to have embraced the arts so much. I literally can't think of any other religion that has embraced the arts to such a degree as we have. So there is something about beauty that we believe as part of our Christian faith makes us connect with God. Oh, sorry, there is great. So where I want to start is that we as a church, basically our whole sort of theology on beauty goes almost all the way back to creation itself, to God creating the world. And as the book of Genesis says, God created mankind in his own image, and in the image of God he created them, male and female. So already from the very beginning of time, we see that God uses images. So the minute he creates this world, he uses images. And therefore, if it's good enough for God to use images, then it's good enough for us as well. And not just that it's good for us to use images. In a way, when we use images in art, we participate in God's creation itself. But what I want to start with, what I want to sort of move into is basically I want to take all of you to Florence in 1501, because that's basically what my talk will be about. And in order to understand what happened in Florence in 1501, a particular artwork that was created then that will take us into the topic, we have to understand what happened in Florence in the 15th century. So Florence became this very successful state in certainly compared to all the neighboring areas in Italy, where the Renaissance flourished. And I think probably of the last 2,000 years, the Italian Renaissance in Florence in the 15th century is certainly one of its pinnacles, mainly largely due to this family, this very wealthy family, the Medicis. The Medicis, they were not sort of any kingly descendants or noble descendants. They were bankers, they were pawnbrokers, they were great patrons of the arts. And Lorenzo de' Medici basically fills most of this 15th century in Florence. Lorenzo il Magnifico he's called, because he is basically the great proponent of the arts. And so in the 15th century in Florence, the arts are starting to flourish. And we have all these artists like Brunelleschi, Mantegna, Massaggio, Fra Angelico, Botticelli, Verrocchio, all this sort of amazing array of the arts. But what is happening is that when Lorenzo de' Medici dies in 1492, things start to go slightly wrong in Florence. They basically lose their sense of identity, and they don't know where any of this now is going. Okay, we've got this magnificent city with these magnificent churches, all this art, but who will now succeed Lorenzo de' Medici? And the successor was his own son, Piero de' Medici, but he was not the greatest of the rulers. He was not the greatest of politicians. And so soon they see from all these neighboring regions that surround them, they see all of them looking upon Florence as wanting to invade Florence and wanting to take over. So there is this identity crisis in the late 15th century, despite all of this magnificent art that is in the city. And then in 1492, so 2 years after Lorenzo de' Medici's death, there is this the King of France, Charles VIII, is now descending into Italy and making his way all the way to Naples. And again, there is this great moment of crisis. Will he invade Florence, or what will we do? Then comes to the fore probably this character that you've all heard of, this Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola. And Savonarola basically says to the Florentines, we are finding ourselves just at the same moment as pre-exile Israel, where all these warning signs that if we don't repent, this awful thing will happen. And in the Old Testament, the exile happened with Israel. So we now in Florence, we got an amazing city, but if we don't repent, then something terrible will happen. And then maybe, yes, the King of France will invade us, or all these neighboring factions will invade us. So he says, you have to repent. And one of the ways to repent is that art shouldn't be this great and massive distraction anymore that we have here in our city. And so he calls for austerity. He calls for going back to scripture, to mass, to its essence, and forget a lot of the magnificence that surrounds it. He becomes so quickly, because he's this magnificent preacher, he becomes so quickly so successful that actually almost the whole of the city is following him. And here we have a portrait. I don't know if you can see. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Perfect. So here we have this portrait of Savonarola on the left. It's a portrait that was painted by Fra Bartolomeo. And on the right, what we see is this bonfire of vanities. So in 1497, so this is roughly only 5 years after Lorenzo de' Medici dies, where a lot of these magnificent artworks are being destroyed on the Piazza dell'Accademia, which you can see there. You can see the square there with the palace in the background and the Duomo in the background on the left. And he gains popularity so quickly that everybody follows him, as I said, and even the likes of Botticelli are said by repute to have destroyed about 30 artworks in that fire. I mean, it's terrible, but that's what he did, because he was a man of great faith and a very devout man as well. But then the rise of Savonarola is as quickly, basically, as his demise. So after a year or two, the Florentines are thinking, well, you know, our city 5-10 years ago was much, much better than it is now. The artists don't have work. Because the artists don't have work, there is less spending of money. And because there's less spending of money, the economy is plummeting, etc. So what happens is that Savonarola, to cut a long story short, gets killed and it gets burnt as well in exactly the same place. So why am I telling you all this? So all this is to say that now we're in 1501. Florence have lost the Medicis. Florence have lost their sense of orientation. They now feel like this tiny city being threatened by all the surrounding cities. And now, what are they to do? As I said, a big identity crisis comes to the fore. As you can see in the next slide here, the Duomo, which was built, this masterpiece of the 15th century, this culmination of Italian high Renaissance art. In the back of the Duomo, just picture it, that to the right of where you see the cupola that was made by Brunelleschi, the builders of the Duomo had left sort of stones and all the rubble behind it. So the Duomo was more or less completed 60 years earlier, 60 years before 1501. And the stones were still there from the building of the Duomo. And it was a mess. And we know this from quite a lot of accounts, that the builders never cleaned up the mess for when they built the Duomo. So comes to the fore this young man who starts to go to the backyard of the Duomo and goes to inspect all these marble stones and other, different marbles, different stones that are lying there. And he comes one day, he comes back the next day, month 1, month 2, 6 months, 8 months. Basically, about for 13, 14 months, this young bearded man comes to inspect the stones. And then in 1501, he goes to the council in Florence and he says to the city council, he says, there is this very big block of marble, the stone that the builders rejected, which I would like to use. And the city say, well, it's been lying there for 60 years. You're more than welcome to use this stone. And they say, well, you can come and collect it. And so the city instructs that this block of marble is now moved to the studio of Michelangelo Buonarroti. And the stone arrives there in the studio, and Michelangelo is now working for about 3 to 4 years on this sculpture. From 1501, he works till 1504 on this magnificent sculpture. And he has a cloth, so the rest of the studio, the artisans that are there, cannot see what he's working on. And then this is ultimately the sculpture that he makes from this stone. A stone that was rejected, a stone that was not wanted to be used. And as you can see there from the image on the right, you can see how slender this stone was, because that was one of the arguments that the city of Florence told to Michelangelo. One of the reasons why he could have the stone, that it was, yes, a very, very tall stone and fairly wide, but it wasn't deep enough to be able to carve anything decent. And I quote out of this marble. And one of the reasons why I show this this sculpture and that I want to talk about, that I'm talking about this sculpture, is that I was fortunate enough to see this sculpture again about 6-7 weeks ago. And what struck me is that when I went to look at the sculpture at the Academia, I mean, it was full of visitors. There were Christians, probably most of them non-Christians, Japanese tourists, Chinese tourists, everybody wanting to take pictures, everybody beholding the beauty that they were looking at. They were swayed by just something special. And I think we often talk, when we talk about art, that, oh, well, is art just merely something subjective, like I like this, and you like that, and you like something else? Or is there art such as the David, which I believe it is, that is objectively beautiful? And I think that's very much what we believe as a church, is that there is such thing as objective beauty. So that is maybe the question that I want to put to you in the room is, do you believe that there is something as part of our Christian heritage, something that is objectively beautiful, and that sort of goes beyond just the merely subjectively pleasing? Thank you, Catherine. That's
Thank you,
my
Father
short sort
Patrick,
of.
very much indeed. And I'm sure we'll have lots of questions later to discuss the issues you've raised, particularly that last question. Stefan, can I call upon you now to take up the baton and talk about the place of beauty in our
Thank you very
language, in
much.
our formation?
Thank you very much, Catherine, as also for the introduction, and thank you, Father Patrick, for that beautiful first go. I'll try and keep up the standards here. So I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. So I'm just going to try and canter through, I suppose, three little ideas or sets of thoughts. First of all, about beauty and culture generally. Then I'm also going to maybe naturally gravitate towards beauty and creation before saying something on beauty and morality and the moral formation of the person. Pope St. John Paul II was visiting a parish in Rome one day. I think he was visiting some children who'd made their first Holy Communion, and they put to him the question, they asked him what would he be doing if he were not the Pope? It's a very natural question for a child to ask, I suppose. His response was, even if I were not Pope, my main task would be to preserve, protect, defend, increase, and deepen this aspiration to the good, the true, the beautiful. So clearly, he saw the good, the true, and the beautiful as critical, in fact, of fundamental importance. Now, I'm sure you know that These three, in the classical and Christian philosophical tradition, we speak of these three as the transcendentals. What that means is that they are, each of them are properties or characteristics of being, or of God himself, as the Christian would say. So according to that tradition, we would say that beauty, in a sense, is synonymous with being or with God, in the same way that truth and goodness are. So beauty, as in and of itself, is not a separate reality to God, but it actually describes him to a certain extent. Now, I think that makes helps us to make sense of that famous line of Saint Augustine, who declared, "Late have I loved you, beauty so old and so new. Late have I loved you." You sure will know that he led a rather colorful life before his conversion. He looked for beauty in all sorts of places, especially in the sensible and immediate pleasures of this world. And they always left him ultimately unsatisfied, and yet still pulled by this desire for something more, for that which transcends this world and is the ultimate source of true beauty, God. So God is the beauty so old that can yet be experienced in new ways when given authentic expression by the work of humankind. And our ability to give new expression to beauty is precisely and only, as Father Patrick has already hinted, because of our being created in the image of God. It is because we are capable of knowing God that we are capable of knowing beauty. And it's both through knowing or recognizing beauty and through that innate desire for it that we are moved to give it expression. It's because of this that John Paul II saw the transcendentals as a particularly apt way to re-evangelize contemporary society. Now, modern thinking, the thinking that underpins modern thought, especially since the Enlightenment, takes a very different approach from the classical Christian way of thinking. It starts with subjective human experience, as opposed to the classical Christian way of thinking that starts with the study of being or God himself. But of course, our subjective experience, it includes those manifestations and those reflections of God himself in the encounter precisely with beauty, as well as with truth and goodness. Every genuine encounter with those transcendentals is an opening to the infinite and the eternal. It's an opportunity to glimpse God himself. So that's why the Polish Pope saw, from well before he was elected, the cultural field as one that was absolutely worth fighting over. Culture serves to express a society's beliefs and indeed also to shape those of future generations. Culture is one of the vehicles through which the truth about the human being, which we know is a fundamentally divine truth, can indeed flow, or it can also be impeded. And artistic beauty in its various forms is one of the most important expressions of human culture. John Paul II spoke of the role of the arts as being alongside that of philosophy and theology. And together, he says they have the task of creating, I quote, a singular anthropological symphony in which the inspiring vein that flows from the perennial Christian message orients all cultures for the greater glory of God and of man, inseparably united to the mystery of Christ. So the role of art and the place of beauty within that is to orient culture towards the greater glory of God and man. And I think this famous painting of the creation of Adam from the Sistine Chapel ceiling by Michelangelo is a very apt image at this point, as are also the words of Saint Irenaeus, for the glory of God is a living man, and the life of man consists in beholding God. So my intention here is to situate beauty in what I would say is its proper place, which is in the relationship between God and man. I want to propose that the role of beauty is to mediate an insurmountable difference. It is to make graspable something of God in order to illuminate us and to draw us towards him. We have here perhaps one of the most famous images, but undoubtedly a beautiful image, which is intended to aid us in our contemplation of the divine mystery. But this image, as I hope you appreciate, is specifically an image of an image. It is an image of the most supreme image that there is of God within his creation. It is an image of man as created in the image of the creator. So I would suggest that in this image, culture has a particular place, metaphorically speaking. Culture, insofar as it comprises of the societal expression of what is beautiful, sits precisely in between those two outstretched fingers. It seeks to represent what is of God by means of what is made by us under his inspiration. So if we just think for a moment about beauty in creation now, you know that this image is from a series that depicts the different days of creation on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And if we think to the Genesis 1 account, Genesis 1 portrays that creative work of God in a very artistic way, we could say, both as a literary piece with its poetic structure, as well as an activity, creation as an activity that is undertaken by God in a very measured, deliberate, considered way that is worthy of contemplation. The structure that the text gives us, the measure by which God's action is described in Genesis 1, is neatly divided into two sets of 3 days. The first 3 days depict this creation of 3 different orders or strata: light and dark, sea and sky, and land. And then the second 3 days depict the filling in of those different canvases, if you want: the sun, moon, and stars, the birds and the fish, and the land animals together with man. If we want to further draw some artistic allusions from the text, we could consider the second verse of Genesis 1, which speaks of the Spirit of God moving over the face of the waters whilst the earth was without form. The Hebrew term for spirit that's used in the text is ruach, which is also translated as wind or breath. And of course, we invoke this concept of breath or spirit when we speak of inspiration, of a drawing in of breath or spirit from the outside, which moves us to produce something beautiful. It's the Spirit of God that is the first mover, to borrow Aquinas' term, in the order of creation. And it's the Spirit of God that is the author of all that is good and beautiful. It's interesting also to note the metaphysical significance of Genesis 1. The text has a very profound content. It sets up a fundamental relationship between things that exist, things that are created, and goodness. All that God creates is declared to be good. And more than that, we could say it's therefore beautiful. The early Greek philosophers recognized this very close-knit relationship between beauty and goodness, so much so that they created a single term to capture both those two transcendentals in one, kalokagatia, if I pronounce that correctly, a word that basically translates to beauty, goodness. And Plato wrote, he said, the power of the good has taken refuge in the nature of the beautiful. So when the Greeks translated, when the Old Testament was translated into Greek, the translators rendered the Hebrew term for goodness, as it appears in Genesis 1, instead with the Greek term for beauty. So we see that creation is indeed beautiful because it is the visible form of what is good, in the same way that goodness, we could say, is the invisible condition of beauty. So to conclude by thinking briefly about morality in moral formation, I hope that I've made it clear that by placing culture generally and the place of beauty within that, in this creation, in this created space between God and man, that it is a significant part of the matrix that surrounds us and that forms our conscience and our sense of morality. So an understanding of beauty that is grounded in this way, that is realistic and not simply subjective, what does it do? It teaches us to look beyond the immediate art to the source of inspiration, to that which provides the invisible condition for beauty. Now, we can think of art that represents nature or landscapes as a very readily example of that. John Ruskin, the famous Victorian polymath, wrote I think it was 5 volumes on landscape painting. And in there, he says that nature presented the laws behind God's creation for mankind. Landscapes, therefore, were worthy insofar as they revealed the truth, the beauty, and the intelligence of God's creation. The harmony that results from a landscape painting, a beautiful one, regardless of the particular style or author, we can say is a reflection of the beauty that we see in the created world, and it moves us to contemplate that beauty or to wonder. But then it's really interesting to read of Ruskin's first solo trip. Ruskin was a good evangelical, of course. Not sure why, of course, but he was anyway. So he makes his first solo trip to Italy. And there, his view of the full splendor of art was drastically changed. He was utterly crushed, as he put it, in his encounter with Tintoretto's crucifixion scene. This artwork moved him to consider the full art of man to be that which captured more than just the material order, but the whole theological panoply of redemption. Suddenly, he saw art as more than just a static reflection of material creation, but a portal to the ongoing drama of salvation, in which all of us have a part to play. And indeed, the first and the most immediate matter for creativity that the Lord entrusts us with as part of giving us dominion over the earth in Genesis 1, the first part of that dominion is our own very being. The male and the female that form part of the created order, the climax of the created order, and are raised as stewards over it as images of the Lord God, they first of all have the task of cultivating their own souls before even the earth. So there is an artistry to human life, whose origin and intended end is the creator. The moral life of the human subject no less depends on being able to perceive authentic goodness than art depends on a clear concept of beauty. And if beauty and goodness are related, then art and virtue have a mutually supporting role to play. St. Thomas Aquinas saw the contemplation of beauty as a necessary strand, one of several necessary things that are part of the project of human perfection. We can also recognize and experience beauty too when we see goodness acted out in some noble way, be it some grand gesture to communicate love or some self-sacrificing action to serve or even save the life of someone else. We readily describe those as beautiful actions. And if beauty, and if such moral beauty is a visible expression of the good, and it can stimulate a positive emotional response that moves us to want to imitate that goodness, that inspires us, then beauty, artistic beauty, is perhaps like a teacher. It serves to invite contemplation. It moves us from the image that we perceive to what is conveyed behind the image. And if moral beauty inspires us to do good, then artistic beauty invites us to wonder, to increase our desire for God by moving us to seek that ultimate sense or source of beauty. Perhaps that's why Dostoevsky famously penned the phrase, "Beauty will save the world." He wasn't speaking of a merely aesthetic beauty, but of its potential as a symbol of the greater interior beauty. The ultimate point of reference for this perfection, the supremely beautiful act by which beauty itself, the incarnate God, gave the world its hope for salvation, is of course the crucifixion that Tintoretto depicts here. This is what John Ruskin saw in Italy, and it is what lifted his gaze from merely created beauty to that of the Creator and the Redeemer himself. Thank you.
Stefan, thank you very much indeed. That was great to hear after Father Patrick. Some great issues here to discuss. I wanted to mention to both of you something that the French philosopher Jacques Maritain said. Maritain, interestingly, was quite a good friend of the artist and Catholic convert Gwen John, who I think really did feel that when she entered into art, she was entering into faith in many ways. And Maritain said that no one can live without delight. That's there's spiritual delight, which can be prayer and can be the sacraments, but there's also delight that comes through art. Do you think that art is almost on a level with prayer, that if we contemplate it in a particular way, it can lead us to God in the same way? It can provide us with that spiritual delight. Can I start with Father Patrick?
Yes, my answer would be yes. So Jacques Maritain, as you said, he wrote art is scholastic, art and scholastic. So he reflects exactly on that question. And what you touch upon, sort of just the sheer delight. One of the arguments that he makes about art, which is a very important argument, is that art is actually playful and something fun, and therefore it's of a higher merit than anything else we do in life. So, and he says, well, most people in life, when they go to work, they work to earn money. To earn money, they want to earn money to send their children to a good school. They send their children to a good school in order to achieve this and that. So he says all of our lives and the daily structure of our life always has a purpose with every action that we do. But when children play in the playground, they just play for the sake of playing. And in that same, and therefore it's of a higher merit because there's no ulterior motive to it. And he says, so it's the same with prayer. The act of prayer is okay. It's a purpose of feeding us spiritually, but it's one of the highest acts that we as people can do, because in a way there is no purpose, tangible purpose to it. And art is on that same level, he would argue, as prayer, that it has this playful and this joyful element to it. And
Is
so
is that is that are you talking about the artist's work, the act of the artist's creation, or is it also something that those of us who are
those
benefiting from that creation, but we are the receivers of it, can also experience?
yeah, it's mainly us as receivers. And I think that's what we do when we go to an art gallery or a show. In a way, there is no further purpose to it than just the enjoyment of the art and to be fed by the art.
Yes.
And Jacques
Thank you.
Maritain, as he said, would then argue, therefore, it's one of the highest activities that we can do.
Stefan, do you have anything to add to that point?
I would second wholeheartedly that yes, first of all. Delighted just immediately made me think of a number of, I can't quite pin them down, but scripture references. Certainly a word that occurs fairly regularly throughout the Bible, either my soul taking delight in the Lord, or God delighting in someone who the man who follows his laws as opposed to sacrifices or things like that. So it has a very good biblical foundation as something that is ultimately the fruit of being before God, of contemplating him. And of course it gets perverted. We see it at the very beginning in Genesis 3 when Eve sees that the apple is a delight to the eyes. So it is, even though she and Adam then misuse God's creation, there is nonetheless delight is a built-in feature of our being, of this dynamic. And I think that any form of art done well and seeking genuinely that source is going to should produce delight, therefore, as a product, if that's the right word. It's not, of that, of a encounter with God, however perfect or imperfect it is. I think, for me, my own experience, maybe it's more with music. I used to play the violin many years ago, and for me there was nothing more delightful, than playing some unaccompanied Bach on the violin, because in my mind Bach, Bach does precisely that with music. He's striving to express something of God, something of what is true and good, and it is written into his music in a way. And I happily understood, some of those moments of playing his music as a prayer. Like it lifted my soul, to God, and it was delightful. And I think I see something again. I love Tolkien, but I always remember that Tolkien said something, when he was writing Lord of the Rings, that it wasn't just something that came purely from his sort of subjective imagination, if you want, but he always felt that there was something almost revealing itself as he created this world, as he wrote about this world, that I believe was that we could, that's why we can understand his writing as a having a mythological character, as something that is using categories or images that we're familiar with to express a reality that is greater, that is invisible but true, that is the ultimate reality, and that I'm sure was a moment of delight for him as well.
Yeah. Now, Stefan, you and Patrick,
Um,
we'll come to your questions in a moment. Could you just bear with us for a second? That would be very fortunate. And could you put your question in the chat and we'll have a look at it? Thank you. I just wanted Stefan to ask you and Patrick that in many ways you're talking about an ideal, this way in which we make use of art um, to understand perhaps our relationship with God better and to enhance our connection with God. But if you think of people nowadays, the kind of busy lives they have, you go to a museum, to somewhere like the Uffizi in Florence or the Louvre in Paris or the National Gallery in London, and you're having to kind of elbow your way past people taking selfies, and there's this kind of great mass of people. How can we experience art nowadays in the way that you're talking about, Stefan? And then Father Patrick, if you could come in too.
Well, thank you. That's a difficult question. We're trapped by the mentality of the modern means of communication and media, where one becomes sort of a tourist in one's own landscape. Everything is seen through the lens of a camera, of Snapchat, Instagram, and there isn't any time to actually engage with the real thing. So how does one defeat that? I'm not sure I have the answer, but perhaps by taking up those same media, as Father Patrick has been doing so well, and trying to push them back onto the person's screen and invite them a little bit more, is maybe that's one strategy. I think the problem also is that then people are far less used to sitting still and contemplating and engaging in that act of opening themselves up to the more than just the immediate sensory experience and thinking beyond it. That is increasingly difficult, just as it is to get people to think nowadays, especially the younger generation, and not just think in terms of information. So I see that as a little bit of an analogy to what we're talking about, rather than just experiencing art and actually contemplating it. I don't know, does one sit them down as a child in a room, lock them in a room with a masterpiece, and then tell them to come out half an hour later with a
Patrick, would you say to people, just elbow your way past people at the Uffizi and see great art, or would you say to them, actually, you'd be better off seeing smaller works of art quietly in a church near you or a hidden away gallery? How can we appreciate art in this way and make this connection with God when it's art has become such a kind of big tourist industry?
Yes, I mean we consume art like we've never done before, and I think we're very fortunate to live in the 21st century because there's just so much art available. I mean, talk about 100 years ago, there were not as many museums, as many public collections, so we are very fortunate that we have access to a lot of amazingly great art, and I think we can't be too purist about it that we have to be alone in a room in front of an artwork and then sort of admire it. I don't know, when I was talking about the David earlier on, I took as much enjoyment to look at Michelangelo's David as watching the people watching the sculpture and admiring it. And so I think it's lovely when you're in a gallery with lots of people and see how they interact with these things. And as I said, I was fascinated by these Japanese tourists saw this figure of David, this figure of the new Christ, because it's ultimately a sculpture of Christ, that they were interacting with it.
I'm very struck by the fact that both of you have referred to Renaissance art, the great Western canon.
Mm.
But of course, there is art across cultures too. And are we at risk, would you say, of not attempting to appreciate the connection between other cultures, art and God? Or is there something special about the Western canon? How would you see that, Father Patrick?
Well, I think as a church we would recognize that in other religions carry certain truths, not the whole truth, but there are certain elements of truth in different religions, whether it's Islam, Buddhism, and it's the same with art. We would consider that some art forms, I mean, whether it's Buddhist art, Inuit art, whatever, carry an inherent beauty. Of course, we would always then link that beauty ultimately to sort of the divine creator, and as an invitation that goes beyond the object itself to put us in touch with God. So again, I think if we as people go to the new museum in Cairo, which I'd love to go and visit, and look at Egyptian art, I think there is great merit in looking at that art, and we can't just sort of just say, all I want to do is look at Christian art.
Yes, we've got some great questions coming up now in the chat. There's one here from Anthony McLaren who says, can there be moral value in art which seeks, perhaps through ugliness, to shock us into an awareness of a wrong that needs to be addressed? Somebody else mentioned Tracy Emin's bed in their question. I don't know if they'd see that as ugly, but what do you think of that idea that Anthony McLaren's just said?
I think I think the value of art is to raise our spirits. So I'm not convinced that that necessarily justifies as a piece of art, as an arte, as a technical endeavor, an artistic endeavor, the depiction of something that is horrible or that is evil. I think there is certainly a need to shock ourselves sometimes into an awareness of what is obviously what is wrong and what is evil. There are ways of depicting that. Perhaps there is a merit in showing the where that intention has gone wrong. I suppose I'm thinking a little bit of Gerald Manley Hopkins' poetry. I forget the name of it, but the speaking of the beautiful countryside effectively that has been destroyed by the mills. Whether it's a case of measuring what we see as good with against the action that we sort of fail to respect what is good, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Patrick, do you want to come in here?
Yes. All I would say is that with Tracy Emin's art, there we are in the subjectively pleasing, and I think it's an expression of how she feels, how she processes all the things that have happened in her life, and therefore, yes, there is artistic merit, but I think it stays sort of in the realm of the subjective, what we were talking about earlier. It doesn't go into the objectively into the objectively beautiful, I'd say, and therefore it's of less. I mean, that's what I would argue. It's of less sort of artistic merit. I mean, it's interesting and it's shocking, but and it's not that the shocking is always subjective, because if you look at Caravaggio, for example, his art was really shocking at the time, but it was subjectively shocking what he was portraying, and yet again objectively beautiful.
Yeah. And Brian asks, Father Patrick, since beauty is so attractive, can beauty swamp goodness and truth at times? He's hinting at a possible risk, I think, there.
Well, it's a very interesting question, and that's what Stefan was talking about truth, goodness, and beauty, the transcendentals. So, what are transcendentals? They transcend time and space. So, whether you were a Roman soldier in the first century or living in the Italian Renaissance, you were always, as a human being, looking for truth. You always want to know the truth about things. You want to surround yourself with good people, try and lead a good life, and surround yourself, if you can, with beauty. Sort of, it's something that's innate in us to seek truth, goodness, and beauty. If I just may very briefly, as a church, I think for the last 2,000 years, and this is not something that I'm necessarily saying, but Hans Urs von Balthasar, the Swiss theologian of the 20th century, and he says, as a church, we've been talking about the truth when we've been talking to the congregation and the faithful. And once we try and convey the truth, then that should lead the people to lead good lives. And once they lead good lives, then there is also this space for beauty. So he says, as a church, we've gone from truth to goodness and beauty. That's how we presented these transcendentals. And he says the church pews will empty themselves in 40, 50 years' time. So he was very visionary, that people will stop coming to Mass. And then we won't be able to talk to, and I can see this with a lot of my friends who don't go to church. And then we can't sort of talk to them and say, listen, can I tell you, can I explain what the truth is, about God or what it is to lead a good life? They would just tell me, they would just run a mile, basically. But beauty has now become this major inroad into the faith because it's like a non-intimidating way to talk about the faith. You simply place someone, I don't know, here at Vespers at the cathedral at 5 p.m. You invite a friend. You don't explain anything about faith. You just put them there for 20 minutes, immersed and submerged in these Gregorian chants. And afterwards, they will always say, what was this that you were singing? And that's the power of beauty. And that's what we try and do with Christian art.
It can draw people in.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, Stefan, John Woodhouse has made a point in the chat. Wondered if you'd like to say anything about this. So we've been talking here about great art, but John Woodhouse says, what can be done about poor art in our churches? Would it be better to have copies of great works? Have you come across poor art and have put your head in your hands and thought?
I certainly have. I can see Father Patrick smiling there, so I'm sure he has too. Yes, honestly, I'd be inclined to say yes, it'd be better to have copies of a great work than poor art, because again, if the point of art is to lift our soul to God, is to help us to contemplate that mystery, that divine mystery, which is beyond us. If the artwork entraps us in trying to understand it, in trying to make head or tail of it, which poor art, I think, by definition does, then we're sort of our vision, our gaze is lowered, is distracted, and it doesn't lead us to where it should lead us. Or if it's clear but it doesn't lead to God, then I would say it's not art in the fully authentic, beautiful sense of the word. So especially in a place of worship, I think it's absolutely important that beauty has a really particular place in our churches, dare I say, in the liturgy as well. I was struck that without entering into the polemics over liturgy, over the different rites, but it's something that Pope Francis couldn't avoid mentioning the importance of beauty in the liturgy, even in the Traditionis Custodes document. And so that culture of beautifying the liturgy in every possible way, I think, starting with the place and with the artwork that surrounds it, is absolutely of prime place, both because it's an aid to our contemplation, it's a pedagogical tool, and as Father Patrick said, it's also a way in. It's an easy way in, if you want, for someone maybe who is, let's say, more on the fringes of their faith.
Patrick, do you want to come back on any of that?
No, that all sounded perfect.
Okay. I'm going to ask you a question that Howard Trust has put in the chat, which I think is something you might want to talk about, given you work at Westminster Cathedral. And Howard Trust has asked, does the virtue of the artist affect the beauty, goodness, truth of their work? And of course, amongst the great art that you have in the cathedral are the works of Eric Gill. And we now know that Eric Gill was a very flawed individual indeed and abused his own daughters. So when people say to you things like that man's work should come down, it has no place in the cathedral, how do you respond?
I would say no, that it doesn't have to come down, I think for two reasons. First of all, the first reason is that the artwork transcends the individual, and that is what great art does. It becomes standalone, has its own merit, it speaks for itself. And yes, for all of us, it's interesting to know the background of the artist, uh, however flawed he or she was, but the artwork ultimately stands on its own. Secondly, with Eric Gill specifically, I know that years ago the cathedral did ask and reach out to his daughter and did put that question to the daughter, the actual victim, and she said, "No, these are not to be removed. I know what my father did was wrong." But so that's the victim herself saying for these stations not to be removed. And then maybe thirdly, I think the all the faithful here, when we just had Lent, every Friday night we move around the stations of the cross, and it's like a cloud of 300-400 people making their way around, and it's just such a beautiful thing. And none of these people, yes, they might know the background, but they contemplate the stations and the artwork and what it represents itself. Yeah.
I think at Ditchling, where there was a community that Eric Gill was part of, they've rehung a lot of art at the gallery there with information acknowledging Gill's life. They haven't done anything like that in the cathedral.
No, we haven't done that. No.
No. Okay. Thank you. Just to keep you on your toes, Lucy, I don't know her surname, asked, what are the dangers of neglect of beauty within the mass? And are there dangers of AI, she has asked, being used? Do you have any thoughts on those?
Yeah, the mass, or maybe Stefan can take it. I don't know.
Yes, and I was going to bring the
Yeah.
Stefan in afterwards.
Yeah, exactly.
Stefan, would you like to have a go at that one?
Yeah, I've said something about liturgy already. I think negatively speaking, neglecting it always involves brings about it with it the danger of reducing our sense of the liturgy of making it more mundane, which is not the point of the liturgy. The point of the liturgy is a meeting point between heaven and earth. It's where heaven touches earth, specifically at the altar, where Christ himself, where his sacrifice is represented. So if we do not beautify, if we do not revere, reverence, and inspire with awe for that moment, then I think we are serving to undermine our faith. Because if beauty is a transcendental, it pushes us beyond the immediate. This is exactly what the mass is about. It's not about the immediate experience of being together, although that's obviously a part of it, but it's about bringing us before God, offering us to God, and receiving him in a very in a way that completely transcends our reason, and that does depend on faith. So yes, I think that is important. AI, I'm not completely sure how that comes into the mass, but I would say it shouldn't have any place in the mass whatsoever.
Well, Graham Paulson is saying that AI could potentially allow us all to create our own art, subject to a few choice prompts. I guess it, make us instantly artistic. He's saying, does this instant art qualify as reflexive of the true and the good in the same way as the masters, or could it? Is it a way of getting through?
I would say no. I've seen quite a lot of AI generated art online. Obviously, videos are that's also true. They can be impressive. I wouldn't call it art for the simple reason that AI does not exist in the world. It does not interact with the world. In the same way that large language models operate, I believe that analogously AI is feeding information from images and videos that are present and then extrapolating from that. And is able even to generate according to different styles that you set. But these are all these are basically renditions based on the data of digitized artistic data. So it's a bit like thinking that an AI bot is actually talking to you, having a conversation to you in an intelligent way. It's not. It's simply working on algorithms, based on the use of language to use language in the appropriate way, to calculate in a calculated way to the words that you've put on the screen. So that art that it generates doesn't relate, has no relationship to the real world. It therefore doesn't have a relationship, a direct relationship in any meaningful way to what is real, which is God ultimately.
I see that Francis, don't know the surname, has said in the chat, I find Orthodox iconography more an aid to prayer and contemplation than much Western sacred art. If we go beyond our Western canon, Stefan, is there a particular art that you find helpful in the ways we've been talking about as something that is inspiring, draws you closer to God, helps you in contemplation?
I have learned to appreciate much more and also to pray with icons actually, the last few years since marrying my beautiful wife who hails from Georgia originally and has a Chaldean Rite background and obviously has situated far more familiarity with the Eastern Church, both Orthodox and Byzantine. So that has opened me up to the beauty of iconography. And as well, we run an iconography course, which is led by a Russian Orthodox deacon at the CHC every year, which is proving incredibly popular and oversubscribed. So that also has made me appreciate the style of iconography, which in some ways appeals to me because of its formality, because of its use of forms and symbolism, and a complete putting aside of the person. I was very struck when I realized, I guess, what is obvious, that all the great icons, they're not signed, they're not known, a lot of them, by who the artist is, because the artist is not important in that schema. The artist is entirely secondary. The point is the piece of art that is there to lead you to contemplate God. So I find that an interesting contrast, obviously, with our Western artistic culture. And there is something beautiful about the way a well-written icon looks at you and invites you into a face-to-face dialogue almost, and what that brings out.
Father Patrick, if you look beyond the Western canon, is there a particular form of art you find particularly appealing and helpful in this desire to get closer to God for yourself?
It's a difficult question. I think I mentioned Egyptian art
Yes.
a few minutes ago, and I think yes, I think that would certainly be the kind of art I would love to explore more and know more about, because that's in a way sort of mankind trying to find its way to not just expressing itself, but how also to depict divine worship, how to reserve the very best of materials for liturgical worship. So they use gold, these precious stones, all to give tribute to the gods. And I think so in all these cultures you can find something that's deeply innate in every human person to try and reserve the very best of things to God. So I probably would say Egyptian art, I think, would be
Yes.
definitely.
And one of the things that perhaps many of us find difficult to understand is that within the Muslim tradition, you don't depict the human form. So I mean, if we had that, we would never depict
No.
Jesus or Our Lady, whatever. We wouldn't have those great Caravaggios that you were mentioning earlier. Do you get a sense of the spiritual when you look at Muslim art in their abstract forms? Do you see it there?
I do, but only up to a certain point. I think when I look at that art, because I can't read sort of Arabic script and calligraphy, it would me want to get more actually to sort of to get different types of art, and I think it's very interesting because of the advent of Islam in the 8th century, that brought about a deep crisis in our Christian church as to what we had to do with religious images. It was the whole sort of iconoclastic controversy, and then comes to the fourth Saint John of Damascus, who says, well, do we follow what the Muslims are doing, or do we still allow ourselves to create graven images and images of God and Jesus? And then he writes these beautiful 3 treatises to the use of divine images, which any of you, if you haven't read them, it's a very short little book, but it's very, very beautiful. And that's really the start of how we as a church really embraced, and all of a sudden sort of all forms of art and visual arts, music, everything.
Yes. I mean, Stefan was talking earlier about how important music is to him, that playing Bach in his violin is a transcendental experience. For you, does music have that similar experience, perhaps when you're in the cathedral and it's Vespers, or does art provide that connection for you in a way that other forms of the artistic
It's it's
ways?
probably, yes, probably art, definitely. For me, I can sit and look at a painting for half an hour without any problem. I will rarely sit in my room and put on a piece of music and just sit still for half an hour to listen to music. I love music when it's part of an experience, like when it's part of the liturgy, part of mass, or go maybe to the opera and listen to music, or as part of a concert. So yes, so for me, music, for me to appreciate it fully, I sort of want it to be part of a wholesome experience, I'd say. Yeah.
We are incredibly privileged people nowadays because we can travel. We can travel to Florence, we can travel, as I did last week, to Bruges, but we're also privileged people because we have so many other ways of accessing art through the internet, through books. In your experience, contemplating Michelangelo's David, looking at it online, looking at it in a book, how does that compare with actually being there to see the real thing? Because you could have a very prayerful moment in your room looking at an image,
Mm.
whereas if you went to Florence, you'd be with this kind of melee. So how important is seeing the real thing rather than the reproduction?
I think it's very important to see the real thing.
And what is it? What makes it different? What is so essential about that?
Because often, if you see the real thing, you see it sometimes in its original context, which makes you appreciate the artwork in a particular way. I think the main thing is to stand in front of the artwork. You see, I don't know, the size matters of a painting. If you see it on your computer screen, you've got no clue whether this is, I don't know, 6 foot by 5 foot, or if it's a tiny thing. And so the artist, when he or she sets out to create an artwork, size is literally the first thing that they will consider. How small, and if it's small, then as a viewer, you have to walk up to it, look at it closely, so you interact with it in a very, very different way. And I think all these things help you to appreciate the artwork. So I very much advocate for, but you need both. I mean, like Stefan's slides of the
Yes.
creation of Michelangelo. So I've never seen it so beautifully on my screen. It looks amazing. So I think to have both is just a luxury, really.
And size is an interesting thing, isn't it? Because we become used to reproduction. So when you go to say the Louvre and see the Mona Lisa, it's actually quite small.
Yes.
Yes. Stefan, anything where you've had the experience? I don't know if you've been able to go to the Sistine Chapel and see
Absolutely.
that great work
I've been a few times,
of
but
creation. So what is the experience of actually seeing the real thing? Why does that matter rather than just what you so helpfully showed us on screen today?
I think first of all, because you have to crick your neck and look up like that. And that suddenly makes you realize that he was painting an incredibly awkward position. And that it was an even greater feat for the physical challenge of where the painting is located and the position that he was in painting it. So that's amazing. And then, yes, and I think the size, the scale, all of that brings you suddenly and context, which in the Sistine Chapel is also very important, because obviously you've got the other panels that complement it, but then you've got all the detail in and around that, whether it's decorative, whether it's the effect of the sort of the architectural features, whether it's little angels and other things, but then also all the other elements of salvation history that he has put, from Noah to Abraham, and then obviously you've got the big, enormous Last Judgment panel that is, right smack in front of your face, on which the moment you lower your gaze, you're confronted with that. So putting everything, again, seeing it as part of the story that Michelangelo intended it to tell, as well as appreciating the technical efforts that went into it, which of course a computer doesn't, a computer screen doesn't replicate. So, but choosing your timings, the last time I was in the Sistine Chapel, I was very fortunate because it was the day after the Vatican museums reopened after the lockdown and COVID, and I was in Rome, legally or illegally, I'm not sure. But the first thing I did was to go to the Vatican museums, and there were perhaps 5 other people in the Sistine Chapel, plus a few security guards. So that was truly special moment.
Indeed. I'm going to draw things to a close now. I want to thank our 2 speakers so much for their fantastic contributions and the inspirational way in which they've guided us through art and how art can draw us closer to God. I'm not able to fully give you the details, but for those of you who are interested in art, please keep an eye out for an announcement, which we hope to make soon, about our annual Craigmile lecture, which is coming up in November, and its subject matter will be very much in this similar area with an extremely prestigious speaker. I think that will be a real treat. I can't say any more at the moment. I'm just going to tease you with that. But do keep your eyes open. It will be announced through the briefing that you can get by email every week from the Catholic Union. If you're not getting the emails, or other people who aren't getting them, please do encourage others to sign up. They're an incredibly useful resource telling you about events that the Catholic Union is putting on, and also other organisations' events as well. Another event that we've got coming up very soon is an in-person event on May the 11th in London, when Christopher Lamb, the Rome correspondent of CNN, will be talking about Pope Leo. Chris has just written a biography of Pope Leo, and being based in Rome, as well as traveling with him to places like Africa, he's watching every step of Pope Leo. So please keep an eye out for that. But once again, I'd like to thank Stefan and Father Patrick and you all for coming along and engaging with the webinar. Somebody's asked if there's a recording available of this. I think there may well be. It was being recorded, so you may well get the opportunity to access it. And I'm sure that Louisa will give you information about that if it's available for the public through the weekly email briefing that I just mentioned. So thank you very much. Thank you for the questions. And it was good to have you all with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you all.